The inheritance trap. The Gilded people often think that tragedy arrives with a scream. They think it's a sudden crash, a loud bang, a moment that stops the world and leaves you gasping for air. But for me, tragedy arrived in a whisper. It arrived in the soft rustle of expensive silk across a marble floor, and the quiet final click of a heavy mahogany door. My name is Elena. I grew up in Briarwood Estate, a house that was less of a home and more of a kingdom. It sat on 50 acres of prime northern coastline, a fortress of old money and older secrets. My father, Arthur, was a man of steel and silence. He had built Briarwood shipping from a single tugboat into an international empire, and he protected that empire with everything he had. To the world, he was a ruthless titan of industry. To me, he was the man who smelled of expensive cherry tobacco and the vanilla scent of old library books. My father didn't speak much. He showed his love in the quiet things. The way he'd leave a rare first edition on my bedside table without saying a word, or how he'd sit in the library with me for hours, both of us reading in a comfortable shared silence. But even then, I felt the weight of his expectations. In Briarwood, everything had its place, and every person had a role to play. Maya was my older sister, and she played her role perfectly. She was everything I wasn't. While I was content to hide in the dim corners of the library, tracing the gold-leaf spines of centuries-old novels, Maya was out in the light. She was radiant, dazzling everyone she met with a laugh that sounded like crystal clinking together in a toast. We were a team. We were the Briarwood girls. I was the heart, and she was the face. We truly believed our father's shadow was long enough and dark enough to protect us from the world forever. I remember one afternoon with painful clarity. I was 12, and Maya was 14. It was one of those humid summer evenings where the air felt thick and gold. We were sitting under the great oak at the very edge of the property, where the manicured lawn met the wild, untamed forest. The sun was setting, casting these long, jagged shadows that looked like fingers reaching for us. I was weaving a crown out of clover, perfectly content. But Maya was restless. She was staring at the house, the massive gray stone beast of Briarwood. "Do you think we'll ever leave here, Elena?" Maya asked. Her voice was flat, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the ocean met the sky. "Why would we want to?" I replied, genuinely confused. "Everything we need is here." "We're safe here." Maya looked at me then, and for the first time in my life I saw a flicker of something hungry in her eyes. It wasn't the hunger for food. It was a hunger for power. "Safe isn't enough," she whispered, pulling a blade of grass apart with surgical precision. "Because this house, the money, the cars, it all belongs to Dad. We're just guests in his kingdom." "I don't want to be a princess, Elena. I want to be the one holding the keys. I want something that is mine and mine alone." I didn't understand her then. I thought it was just teenage angst. I didn't realize that hunger was a seed. Over the next decade, Julian would be the one to water that seed, turning it into a fire that would burn our family to the ground. Julian didn't burst into our lives with a flourish. He seeped into them, like a slow-moving stain on a white rug that you don't notice until it is far too late to clean. He was a junior partner at a law firm. My father did business with a man with a sharp suit and an even sharper mind. The first time I saw him was at my father's 60th birthday gala. The house was filled with the scent of jasmine and expensive perfume. People were laughing, trying to impress my father with talk of mergers and stock options. But Julian was different. He wasn't talking, he was watching. He stood by the marble fountain in the foyer, his eyes tracking Maya as she moved through the room. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that the front door to the Briarwood fortune was guarded by my father's iron will. But the back door? That was wide open, and it led straight through the heart of the eldest daughter. I watched them dance that night. Julian moved with a grace that felt practiced, mechanical, almost. He whispered something into Maya's ear, and she let out that crystal laugh, throwing her head back. She was glowing. But when I looked at Julian's face over her shoulder, my blood ran cold. His eyes weren't on her. They were darting around the ballroom, appraising the heavy crystal chandeliers, the priceless oil paintings, the silver service. He wasn't looking at a woman he loved. He was looking at a balance sheet he intended to own. "There's something wrong with him, Maya," I told her a week later. We were in her dressing room, which was overflowing with shopping bags and designer dresses Julian had bought her. "You're just jealous, Elena," she snapped, her voice sharper than a razor. "You've spent so much time in your books that you don't know what real romance looks like. Julian sees me. He doesn't see Arthur Briarwood's daughter or a shipping heiress. He sees me." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her that Julian saw exactly what he wanted to see, a shortcut to the top. But I stayed quiet. I let the silence grow between us, a wide chasm that Julian would eventually fill with lies. That was my first mistake. Within a year of the gala, Julian and Maya were married. It was the wedding of the century, a display of wealth that felt more like a coronation. And almost as if it had been scripted, within 18 months of the wedding, my father started to die. It started small, a tremor in his hand when he reached for his coffee. Then a slip of the tongue, forgetting a name he'd known for decades. Then, the man of steel couldn't walk without a silver-topped cane. The doctors were baffled. They ran tests, took blood and performed scans, eventually calling it atypical neurodegeneration. But I saw the truth. I saw the way Julian took charge of the home care. He was so helpful, so attentive. He was the one who hired the private nurses. Julian was the one who took over the pharmacy runs, ordering special organic supplements from a clinic halfway across the country. He became the gatekeeper of the second floor. The house changed. The laughter died. The grand piano was covered in a heavy velvet cloth that gathered a thick layer of dust. I would sit in the library, the same place where my father taught me the magic of words, and I would listen. I listened to the footsteps upstairs. Julian's footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate. They sounded like someone who already owned the floorboards he was walking on, just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. I would try to visit my father, but Julian was always there, sitting in the shadows of the bedroom like a vulture. "He's resting, Elena," he'd whisper, his hand firm and cold on my shoulder. "The medication makes him confused. He's agitated. He shouldn't see you like this. It breaks his heart." He was gaslighting me in my own home. He was turning my father's bedroom into a vault, and he held the only key. One night, desperation overcame my fear. I waited until I heard the nurse downstairs in the kitchen, and I crept toward my father's room. The hallway felt longer than usual, the family portraits on the walls seeming to watch me with judging eyes. I slipped inside. The air in the room was stifling, smelling of ozone, antiseptic, and peppermint. My father was awake. His eyes, once so sharp and commanding, were darting wildly toward the door. When he saw me, a flicker of the old Arthur Briarwood returned. He tried to sit up, his frail hands clawing at the silk sheets. "Elena!" he rasped. It was a terrifying sound, like dry leaves rubbing together in a graveyard. "I'm here, Dad. I'm right here," I whispered, tears blurring my vision. He grabbed my wrist with a strength that shocked me. He pulled me close, his breath cold against my ear. "The ledger," he whispered, his voice frantic. "The blue ledger, Elena, listen to me. It's behind the portrait in the..." Before he could finish the sentence, the door clicked open with a sound like a gunshot. Julian stood there, framed by the cold light of the hallway. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a parent catching a child with their hand in the cookie jar. "Elena," he said softly, his voice dripping with fake concern. "I told you. He's in a state of advanced confusion. You're only making his final days harder. Go to bed." I looked at my father one last time, but the light had gone out of his eyes again. He went limp against the pillows, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling. That was the last time my father ever spoke to me. He died 3 days later. My father's funeral was a masterpiece of Julian's design. It was grand, expensive, and entirely hollow. I stood there in the rain, watching the man who raised me be lowered into the earth, and I felt like an extra in a play I hadn't auditioned for. 2 days later, the real play began. We were in the lawyer's office. Mr. Sterling had been my father's legal counsel and friend for 30 years, but as he sat across from us, he couldn't look me in the eye. He kept adjusting his glasses, his hands trembling as he shuffled a thick stack of papers. Maya sat next to Julian, her face hidden behind a heavy black lace veil. She looked like a classic widow, even though it was our father who had died. Julian sat perfectly still, a statue of professional mourning, his hands folded neatly on his lap. "I'll skip the legal jargon," Mr. Sterling said, his voice cracking slightly. "The will was updated 3 months ago, while Arthur was still of sound mind. 3 months ago. At the height of my father's confusion, at the height of Julian's caregiving. To Julian and Maya, I leave the Briarwood estate, the controlling shares of Briarwood Shipping, and the entirety of the family trust." The words felt like physical blows to my chest. I sat there waiting for my name. Waiting for the moment my father remembered his little bookworm. To Elena. I leave a one-time payment of $50,000, to be paid upon her vacating Briarwood estate within 30 days. And I leave her the small summer cottage in North Cove. The room went so silent, I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. $50,000. In the world of Briarwood, that was a rounding error. It was an insult. It was a dismissal. "That's it?" I asked. My voice sounded tiny, like it belonged to the 12-year-old girl under the oak tree. "That is the final witnessed wish of Arthur Briarwood," Sterling replied, finally looking at me. His eyes were swimming with shame and something else, fear. Julian leaned over and patted my hand. His skin felt like a reptile's, cold and dry. "Don't worry, Elena," he whispered, loud enough for the room to hear his generosity. "Maya and I have already talked about it. You don't have to go to that drafty, broken-down cottage. You can stay with us, at the estate, as our guest. We'll take care of you. Just like your father would have wanted." I looked at Maya. I searched through that black lace veil for my sister, the girl who used to chase away my nightmares. But all I saw was a stranger who was finally holding the keys to the kingdom. I was no longer a daughter of Briarwood. I was a guest in a house that wanted me gone. They say that you don't realize the air is getting thinner until you're already gasping for breath. Moving out of my childhood bedroom wasn't a choice. It was presented as a necessity. "We need the west wing for the new nursery, Elena," Julian had said, his voice as smooth and cold as a marble countertop. "And the other rooms, well, they need to be prepared for the business associates who will be staying over. You understand, don't you? It's about the legacy now." I moved my life into 3 cardboard boxes. 10 years of journals, my father's first editions, and a few sweaters that still smelled like the library. I walked up the narrow, creaking stairs to the 3rd floor, the old servants' quarters. The air up here was different. It didn't smell like jasmine and beeswax. It smelled of damp wood, mothballs, and the lonely history of people who had been forgotten. My new room was a sliver of space under the eaves. The ceiling slanted so low I had to duck to reach the bed, a narrow cot with a thin mattress that felt like sleeping on a pile of stones. There was one window, a small circular thing that looked out over the back gravel pits, not the ocean. From here I couldn't see the sunrise. I could only see the trucks delivering supplies for Julian's new life. I spent the first night sitting on those boxes, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, watching the moon crawl across the sky. Downstairs, I could hear the muffled sounds of music and laughter. Julian and Maya were celebrating. They were opening the vintage wine from my father's cellar bottles he had saved for a special occasion. I realized then that my father's death was their special occasion. I wasn't a guest. I was a ghost haunting the rafters of my own home, and Julian? He was the exorcist, waiting for me to fade away completely. The transition from guest to servant didn't happen overnight. Julian was far too clever for that. He used the language of contribution. "Elena, the staff is quite overwhelmed with the transition," he told me a week later, cornering me in the kitchen while I was making a cup of tea. He looked at my tea bag like it was a personal theft from his pocket. "It feels unfair for you to sit in the attic while everyone else works so hard. It might help your grief if you kept busy. Why don't you take over the silver?" My mother always said there's a meditation in polishing, so I polished. I spent 8 hours a day in the windowless butler's pantry, my hands turning black with tarnish. Then it was the laundry, then it was the floors. By the end of the 2nd week, Julian had let the head housekeeper go, a woman who had worked for us for 20 years. She was redundant, Julian explained, not even looking up from my father's desk. And besides, we have you. You know the house so well, Elena. You have a touch for it. Every time I looked at Maya, she looked away. She had traded her voice for a seat at the head of the table. She wore my mother's pearls, but she didn't have my mother's heart. When I would pass her in the hallway, carrying a heavy tray of Julian's lunch, she would suddenly find something fascinating to look at in the wallpaper. Maya, please, I whispered once, catching her alone in the garden. He's making me scrub the floors. He's taking away my books. Talk to him. She didn't look at me. She just adjusted her black lace cuff. You should be grateful, Elena. Most sisters wouldn't let you stay after the way you treated the will. Julian is trying to give you a purpose. Don't be ungrateful. Ungrateful. The word felt like a slap. I realized then that Julian hadn't just stolen the money. He had stolen my sister. He had convinced her that I was the enemy, the unstable one who couldn't be trusted with the Briarwood name. I stayed because of my father's final words. The blue ledger. Every night, after Julian and Maya had retreated to the master suite and the house settled into its uneasy, creaking sleep, I would creep down the back stairs. My feet knew every loose board, every groan of the ancient wood. I moved like a shadow through the library. The room felt different now. Julian had replaced my father's comfortable leather chairs with modern, sharp-edged furniture. It felt like a showroom, not a place for thought. But the books remained. Julian didn't care for reading. To him, books were just wallpaper for a wealthy man. I searched the shelves for weeks. I pulled out every blue book I could find. Biographies, maritime histories, old ledgers from the shipping company. None of them were the ledger. I began to wonder if Julian was right, if my father had been confused at the end. But then, I remembered his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a dying man losing his mind. They were the eyes of a man trying to lock a door before the monster got in. I stood before my mother's portrait. It was a massive oil painting, commissioned when she was only 25. She looked so much like Maya, but with a softness around the mouth that Maya had long since lost. My father had loved this painting. He used to sit in front of it for hours after she died, just talking to her. I reached out and touched the frame. It was cold. I ran my fingers along the bottom edge, feeling the ornate gold leaf. And then my heart stopped. The frame didn't sit flush against the wall. There was a gap, a small hidden hinge on the left side. My hands were shaking so hard I thought the candle would fall. I pulled at the frame, and it swung open with a silence that suggested it had been oiled recently. Behind it wasn't a wall safe with a complex code. It was a simple recessed shelf. And there it was. The blue ledger. It wasn't a shipping log. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a journal. I took it back to my attic room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I hid under my thin blanket, using a small penlight to read the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably my father's, strong, jagged, and full of a growing dread. August 14th, the first entry began. Julian thinks I don't notice the change in the tea. He thinks I, an old man who doesn't know the difference between a vitamin and a sedative. But I see him. I see the way he looks at the company accounts when he thinks I'm sleeping. He isn't here for Maya. He's here for the liquidation. If you are reading this, Elena, it means I failed to stop him. You are the only one left who isn't blinded by his light. Look at the payments to SK, look at the fire records from 2018. The truth isn't in what he says. It's in what he destroyed to get here. I stopped breathing. My father hadn't died of a condition. He had been slowly erased. And I was living in a house with a man who had murdered my father and was currently working on destroying me. I heard a floorboard creak outside my door. I shoved the ledger under my thin mattress and clicked off the light, my breath caught in my throat. The door didn't open, but I saw the shadow of Julian's feet under the gap. He stood there for a long time, 3 minutes that felt like 3 centuries. Then he whispered through the wood. I know you're awake, Elena. Don't stay up too late. Tomorrow we have a lot of cleaning to do. The attic is a mess. Having the truth is one thing. Carrying it is another. For 3 days after I found the blue ledger, I felt like I was walking through a house made of glass and I was the only one holding a stone. Every time I looked at Julian, I didn't just see my brother-in-law or the man who had stolen my father's company. I saw a murderer. I hid the ledger inside the lining of my winter coat, the one tucked at the very bottom of my storage box. I knew Julian would come back to the attic. He was a predator who liked to mark his territory, and my small sliver of space was no exception. He didn't just want me to be a servant. He wanted me to feel his presence in the very air I breathed. The work became harder. He had me reorganizing the basement, a damp labyrinthine space that hadn't been touched in decades. It was backbreaking work, moving heavy crates of old shipping records, breathing in the dust of 50 years. "It's for the audit, Elena," Julian would say, standing at the top of the basement stairs, his silhouette blocking out the light from the hallway. "We need everything accounted for. The company needs to be lean if we're going to survive the transition." I knew what he was really doing. He was keeping me underground. He was keeping me tired. A tired mind doesn't ask questions. A tired mind doesn't notice the strange cars parked at the end of the driveway at 2 a.m. But my mind wasn't tired. It was on fire. I spent my breaks in the basement huddled over a flickering bulb, researching the initials my father had left. SK. I went through every employee record from 2018, every shipping manifest, every legal filing. I found hundreds of S's and K's, but none of them felt right. None of them carried the weight of a secret worth killing for. Until I found the discontinued folder. Her name was Sarah Kane. She was 26 years old in 2018, a junior accountant for a firm that Julian had worked at before he met Maya. According to the internal records, she had been terminated due to gross negligence. But the notes in the margin, written in my father's jagged scrawl, told a different story. SK found the offshore accounts my father had written. She tried to go to the board. Julian handled it. Handled it. In Julian's world, that was a polite way of saying he had erased a human being. I dug deeper, my fingers stained black with old ink. I found a newspaper clipping tucked behind the folder. Local woman perishes in unexplained residence fire. The fire had happened in a small town 3 counties away. The cause was listed as faulty wiring. The same faulty wiring Julian had mentioned to the insurance adjusters after my father's health began to fail. The pattern was starting to emerge, and it was a pattern made of smoke and ash. Julian didn't create new lives. He just set fire to the old ones and walked away while they were still burning. I realized then that Maya wasn't just his wife. She was his next payout. He didn't love her. He was just waiting for the right time to light the match. The basement door creaked open above me. I shoved the folder into a crate of old tax forms and grabbed a broom, my heart hammering against my ribs. Julian didn't come down. He just stood there for a long time, the shadow of his polished shoes visible on the top step. "Elena?" he called out. His voice was too sweet, like honey poured over a blade. "Maya is feeling a bit lonely. She wants you to come up and help her with the seating chart for the foundation gala. It's time you remembered your place in this family." The gala was Julian's way of announcing himself to the world as the new king of Briarwood. He wanted everything perfect. And since he had fired most of the house staff to save on overhead, the most dangerous jobs fell to me. "That chandelier hasn't been properly cleaned in years, Elena," Julian said, gesturing to the massive crystal structure in the library. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing, hundreds of sharp glass prisms hanging 30 feet above the marble floor. "I do it myself, but I have a meeting with the board. And Maya is far too delicate for heights." I climbed the ladder. It was one of those old wooden ones, tall and narrow. As I reached the top, the world seemed to tilt. The marble floor below looked like a cold, unforgiving sea. Julian stood at the base, his hand resting lightly on the wood. "Steady now," he said. "We wouldn't want the last of the Briarwoods to have an unfortunate accident before the party starts." I began to polish, my hands trembling. I could feel his eyes on me. It wasn't the look of a concerned brother. It was the look of a man waiting for a timer to go off. Suddenly, the ladder jerked. Just an inch, but it was enough. I grabbed the center pole of the chandelier, my heart in my throat. Below me, Julian had slipped. "Oh, careful there, Elena!" he cried out, his voice full of fake alarm. He didn't tighten his grip. He stepped back, leaving the ladder to wobble dangerously. The floor is so slippery today. Maybe I should go get the nurse. He didn't move to help. He just watched me dangle there, 30 feet in the air, clinging to a 100-year-old piece of glass that felt like it was about to rip out of the ceiling. In that moment, I saw it in his eyes. The permission. He was giving the world permission for me to die. It wouldn't be murder. It would just be the tragic fall of a grieving, unstable sister. I didn't scream. I didn't give him the satisfaction. I slowly, painfully, lowered myself down the wobbling ladder until my feet touched the marble. Julian was right there, his hands out as if he'd been trying to save me the whole time. "Thank God," he whispered, his eyes cold and disappointed. "You really should be more careful, Elena. You're all Maya has left." It would be a shame if she had to mourn 2 family members in 1 year. I couldn't stay in the house anymore. The walls were closing in, and every meal felt like it might be my last. I had reached out to the one person I thought might help, Elias, the contractor my father had mentioned in his older notes. I met him at the edge of the property, where the great oak stood like a silent witness in the rain. He was sitting in a beat-up sedan, the engine idling roughly. "You're Arthur's girl," he said, his voice a low, gravelly growl. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, watching the lights of Briarwood estate. "Your father was a good man." He knew Julian was a snake, but he was too late to cut the head off. "Tell me about Sarah Kane," I said, the rain soaking through my thin coat. Elias finally looked at me. His eyes were full of a deep, weary fear. "Sarah didn't die because of wiring, Elena. She died because she found the signatures. Julian wasn't just stealing from the firm. He was forging your father's name on property transfers years before he even married your sister." He handed me a small, water-damaged envelope. "These are the copies she gave me before the fire. I've been running for 5 years. Julian has people everywhere. Lawyers, cops, judges. He doesn't just kill people. He buys the silence of the ones who are left." As I took the envelope, a pair of headlights appeared at the top of the driveway. High beams, cutting through the rain like searchlights. "Go!" Elias hissed. "If he finds you with me, he won't wait for an accident next time." I ran back toward the house, my lungs burning, the cold mud sucking at my shoes. I made it to the servants' entrance just as the black SUV pulled into the garage. I hid in the shadows of the laundry room, my heart hammering. I heard the car door slam. Then I heard Julian's voice, not the sweet, fake voice he used with Maya, but a sharp, biting tone. "I don't care what it costs," he was saying into his phone. "Elena is getting too close. She's been in the basement. She's been talking to people. I want the liquidation moved up. If the house has to go, let it burn. Just make sure she's inside when it happens." The rain didn't stop. It hammered against the slate roof of Briarwood like it was trying to wash the house into the sea. I stood in Maya's doorway, my clothes soaked, my shoes caked in the mud from the great oak. I looked like a madwoman, but I felt more sane than I had in months. I had the proof. I had the ledger, the signatures, and the ghost of Sarah Kane in my hands. "Maya, you have to listen to me," I said, my voice cracking with a mixture of exhaustion and terror. "I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to look at the paper. Just look at the dates." Maya didn't turn around. She was staring at her reflection in the 3-way mirror, adjusting a diamond necklace that had once belonged to our grandmother. "Julian told me you'd come here tonight. Elena, he told me you were getting worse, that the grief was twisting your mind." "It's not the grief, Maya. It's him." I walked forward and slammed the blue ledger onto her vanity, right next to her crystal perfume bottles. "Dad wasn't sick. He was being poisoned." He wrote it down. "He knew Julian was liquidating the trust before he even proposed to you. Look at the names. Look at Sarah Kane." Maya finally turned, but her face wasn't filled with concern. It was filled with a cold, jagged pity. Sarah Kane was a thief who tried to blackmail Julian's firm. "He told me everything, Elena. He was honest with me when no one else was. He told me how you've been sneaking into the basement, how you've been meeting with contacts in the rain. He's worried about you." "I'm worried about you. He's worried I'll expose him." I grabbed her shoulders, trying to force her to see me, to see the sister who had shared every secret with her since childhood. He's planning to burn this house down with us inside it. I heard him on the phone, Maya. He called it liquidation. He's going to kill you for the insurance just like he did to Sarah. Maya shoved my hands off her. She stood up, looking taller and colder than I had ever seen her. Enough. You're sick, Elena. You've always been jealous of the attention I got, even when we were kids. You couldn't handle that Dad trusted Julian more than he trusted his own bookworm daughter. Julian isn't a murderer. He's the man who saved this family from your father's mismanagement. Our father didn't mismanage anything. I screamed, but it was like shouting at a stone wall. Julian is calling a doctor tomorrow, Maya said, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. A facility where you can get the rest you need. Until then, you are to stay in the attic, for your own safety. And for hours, she didn't look at the ledger. She didn't look at the signatures. She looked at me as if I were a stain she was finally ready to scrub away. She walked to the door, opened it, and Julian was standing there, his face a mask of sorrow. I heard everything, Elena, he said softly. It's okay. We're going to get you help. He didn't use force. He didn't have to. He just stood there, a wall of calm between me and the sister I no longer knew. I walked past him, my head down, clutching the ledger to my chest. As I climbed the stairs to the attic, I heard the heavy bolt of the hallway door click shut. I wasn't a guest anymore. I was a prisoner. The attic became my universe. The circular window was my only connection to a world that was rapidly being stolen from under me. For 2 days, I watched the slow-motion robbery of Briarwood estate. Julian was thorough. In the dead of night, while the town slept, he was hollowing out the kingdom. I saw the grandfather clock that had stood in the foyer for a century being wrapped in moving blankets. I saw the crates of rare wine from the cellar. I saw the silver, the paintings, the history of the Briarwood name being loaded into the back of unmarked white trucks. He wasn't just liquidating, he was erasing. If there was no house, and no one left to remember what was inside it, there would be no crime. My meals were brought to me by a new nurse, a man with thick arms and eyes that never met mine. He would place a tray on the floor, wait for me to take it, and then lock the door behind him. I stopped eating the food after the first day. The bitterness at the back of my throat reminded me too much of the vitamins Julian had given my father. I spent the hours huddled in the corner, reading the blue ledger over and over, memorizing every word. My father's voice was the only thing keeping me sane. Look at the fire records. The truth is in what he destroyed. I looked at the walls of the attic. The wood was old, seasoned by 100 years of salt air and history. It would burn like tinder. I checked the window. It was too small for a grown woman to fit through, and the drop to the gravel pit below was a death sentence. On the third night, the house went silent. Not the usual silence of a sleeping home, but a heavy, artificial quiet. No music from downstairs, no clinking of Maya's jewelry. Just the wind and the sound of something liquid being splashed against the floorboards in the hallway below. I managed to pick the lock of the attic door using a pin from my mother's old brooch. My father had taught me how to do it when I was 10, a just-in-case skill he'd learned on the docks. I didn't think I'd ever need to use it against my own family. The hallway was dark, and the air smelled sharp, a chemical scent that made my eyes water. Accelerant. He hadn't even tried to hide it. He knew the fire department was 20 minutes away, and by the time they arrived, Briarwood would be a chimney. I crept down to the second floor. Maya's room was empty. Her suitcases were gone. Her jewelry boxes sat open and hollow on the vanity. He had already moved her out. He had moved her to the cottage or some other safe house, convincing her that I was too dangerous to be near. He had isolated her completely so that he could finish the job here. I reached the library. The room was a shell. The books were still there, worthless to Julian, but the art and the silver were gone. Julian was standing in the center of the room, looking at the portrait of our mother. He had a metal canister in his hand, the kind used for industrial cleaning. She really was beautiful, he said, not even turning around. He knew I was there. He had probably been counting the seconds until I escaped. It's a shame. All this history turned to ash because of a faulty heater in a drafty attic. People will say it was a tragedy. They'll say poor Elena was so distraught she didn't even try to get out. Maya won't believe you, Julian, I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my knees. She knows I'm not suicidal. Julian turned then, and he smiled. It was the same charming predatory smile he'd used at the gala. It was the same charming pretty same charming predatory smile he'd used at the gala. Maya will believe exactly what I tell her to believe. Because I'm the only thing she has left. I'm her husband, her protector, and the man who manages her multi-million-dollar trust. She needs me to be the hero, Elena. So that's who I am. He tipped the canister. A clear, pungent liquid began to pour over the antique Persian rug. Where is she, Julian? She's safe. At a hotel in the city, waiting for me to join her after I check on the house. One last time. He pulled a silver lighter from his pocket, my father's lighter. You know, Arthur really did love this house. It's poetic, don't you think? Ending it with his own flame. The fire didn't crawl. It leaped. Within seconds, the doorway was a curtain of orange and black. The heat was a physical blow, a wall of energy that pushed the air right out of my lungs. Julian stood on the other side of the flames, his face illuminated by the destruction he had invited into our home. He didn't look like a man committing a crime. He looked like a man finishing a chore. Goodbye, Elena, he shouted over the roar of the rising heat. Try not to make it too hard on the investigators. A quick end is better for everyone's story. He turned and walked toward the foyer, disappearing into the smoke. I was alone in the library. The room that had been my sanctuary was becoming my tomb. The fire was eating the curtains, climbing the mahogany shelves, and licking at the edges of the portrait of my mother. I looked at the portrait, the blue ledger behind the... My father hadn't been talking about the ledger I found. He had been talking about the second safe. The one Julian hadn't found because he didn't know the house like I did. He didn't know the stories. I didn't run for the fire. I ran for the wall. I pushed the portrait aside, the heat searing my skin, and I felt for the latch. Not the hinge on the left, the one on the right. The wall panel slid back, revealing a small, fireproof lockbox and a narrow, hidden staircase that led directly to the old coal cellar. It was the servant's escape, a relic from the 1920s that had been boarded up for decades. The smoke was thick now, black and oily. I grabbed the lockbox, threw my weight against the rotted wooden door of the staircase, and fell into the dark just as the ceiling above me began to collapse. Briarwood was dying. But as I tumbled down those stairs, clutching the final piece of the ledger, I knew one thing. I wasn't going to die with it. I emerged from the earth like a secret that refused to stay buried. The air outside was cold, wet, and smelled of salt, but to my smoke-clogged lungs, it tasted like the sweetest vintage in my father's cellar. I lay in the mud for a moment, gasping, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Behind me, Briarwood was screaming. That was the only way to describe the sound of a century-old house dying. The antique timber groaned. The glass of the grand windows shattered from the heat, and the roar of the fire sounded like a living beast devouring everything my father had built. Julian's liquidation was complete. To the world, I was currently becoming ash in that library. I looked down at the lockbox in my arms. It was heavy, made of reinforced steel, and hot to the touch. This was the real blue ledger. Not just a journal of suspicions, but the physical evidence my father had gathered when he realized his life was being stolen. I didn't have time to mourn the house. I could already hear the distant, wailing sirens of the fire department, but I knew they wouldn't arrive in time to save anything but the chimney. I had to move. I had to reach Maya before Julian could finish his performance. I ran to the old gardener's shed, where my father used to keep an old beat-up truck for hauling mulch. It was a relic, hidden under a tarp, likely forgotten by Julian in his rush to sell off the luxury fleet. The keys were where they always were, stuck under the wheel well. The engine turned over with a protesting roar, coughing out a cloud of black smoke that disappeared into the rain. I put the truck into gear and drove through the woods, bypassing the main gates where the fire trucks would soon be swarming. I wasn't running away. I was going to the one place Julian felt most secure, the Grand Continental Hotel. Walking into the Grand Continental felt like walking into another dimension. The lobby was a sea of white marble, soft jazz, and people who had never known a day of real hunger or fear in their lives. I was a nightmare personified. My dress was torn and blackened, my hair was a bird's nest of ash, and there was a streak of blood across my forehead from the coal cellar. The concierge tried to stop me, his face twisted in a mask of polite horror. "Miss, you can't be in here." "I am Elena Briarwood," I said, my voice sounding like it was vibrating through stone. "And if you touch me, I will make sure the morning news knows exactly why the Grand Continental turned away the survivor of the Briarwood fire." He froze. The name Briarwood still held power, even when it was covered in soot. I pushed past him and stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the penthouse suite. The ride-up was silent, the gold-plated doors reflecting a version of myself I didn't recognize. I looked like my father. Not the man who had died in that bed, but the man who had built an empire. The steel was back in my spine. When the doors opened, I heard Julian's voice. He was on the balcony of the suite, his back to the room. I could see the silhouette of my sister Maya, sitting on the sofa, her face buried in her hands. "I tried, Maya," Julian was saying, his voice a masterpiece of manufactured grief. "I tried to get to the attic, but the stairs... the smoke was just too much. I called out for her, but there was no answer. I'm so sorry." "I'm so sorry." "You're a liar, Julian," I said, stepping into the room. The silence that followed was so thick I felt like I could reach out and snap it. Maya looked like she was about to faint, her eyes wide, her hands trembling as she reached toward me. "Elena?" she whispered. "How?" Julian said what he needed to say to make sure I didn't walk out of that house. I said, my eyes locked on him. He was trapped. He was in a tuxedo, smelling of expensive cologne, while the scent of the fire I had just escaped filled the room. This is a miracle," Julian stammered, his mind racing to find a new lie. "Elena, you're alive. I thought the library." "Stop," I said. I reached into the lockbox. I didn't pull out more papers. I pulled out a small digital voice recorder. "My father knew you were a snake, Julian. But he also knew that in a court of law a sick man's word isn't enough. So he made sure you said the truth when you thought no one was listening." I pressed play. The room was filled with the sound of my father's bedroom, the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator. And then Julian's voice, cold, sharp, and stripped of all its charm. "You're taking too long to die, Arthur," the recording Julian said. "The board is getting restless. The liquidators are already at the gates. Don't worry about Maya, she'll be taken care of until the insurance clears. And Elena? Well, the attic is a very dry place. One spark is all it takes." Then my father's raspy voice. "She has the ledger." Recording Julian laughed. "The blue one on the shelf? I found that months ago, old man." "It's already gone." My father's voice came back, one last time stronger than before. "Not that one." Julian didn't try to run. He knew the recording was the end. He just stood there, his eyes turning into two black coals of hatred. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed at me. "I have the best lawyers in the country." That recording was taken without consent. "It won't hold up for 10 minutes in a courtroom." "Maybe not," I said. "But the offshore account numbers in this box will. The signatures you forged for Sarah Kane will. And the fact that the fire department just found 5 canisters of industrial accelerant in your car? That's going to be very hard to explain." Elias stepped into the room, his face grim. He had gone to the police the moment I left the Great Oak. He had brought the documents I'd given him, and the police had arrived at Briarwood just as the fire started. They had seen Julian's car leaving the scene. Maya walked over to me. She didn't say a word. She just wrapped her arms around me, sobbing into my soot-stained shoulder. For the first time in years, the black veil was gone. She wasn't the queen of Briarwood anymore. She was just my sister. As the police led Julian away in handcuffs, he stopped in front of me. He leaned in, his voice a low, venomous growl. "You still lost, Elena. The house is gone. The money is tied up in litigation. You have nothing." I looked him in the eye and smiled. "I have the truth, Julian. And for a Briarwood, that's the only currency that ever mattered. Briarwood estate is gone. The ruins were cleared away. And the land was donated to the state as a bird sanctuary, a place where things can grow without being pruned by a greedy hand. The litigation took 2 years. Julian is serving 25 to life for the murder of Sarah Kane and the attempted murder of, well, me. Maya and I live in the cottage in North Cove now. It's small, it's drafty, and it's perfect. We don't have the shipping empire. We don't have the gala gowns or the marble foyer. But we have a shared silence that isn't filled with secrets. I still keep a ledger. But this one is different. It's filled with plans for the future. It's filled with the stories of the people Julian tried to erase. And every morning, when I wake up to the sound of the waves and the smell of the salt air, I realize that my father was right. Paper never lies. And the truth? The truth is the only thing that can never be liquidated. My name is Elena Briarwood, and this was the final entry in the hidden ledger.